Hi, good evening, everyone, and Hanukkah Sameach. My name is Steve Weinberg. Welcome to my lecture entitled The Humor of Franz Kafka, Modern, Absurd, Jewish. So tonight, of course, we're going to talk about Franz Kafka, the famous modernist author from the early 20th century, writing from Prague, Jewish writer. And while we're going to talk about Kafka, we're going to spend more time talking about humor, specifically why we laugh, what makes things funny, what's the theory behind humor. And I should warn you, of course, that humor is something very subjective, so we all have different understandings of what's funny, and that's not a good or a bad thing, but we should be aware of that. And I believe that what we find funny also informs our worldview. Sort of how we see the world is reflected in what we find funny. And one more thing about humor is there's a famous quote that dissecting or analyzing a joke is a bit like dissecting a frog. The thing dies in the process, and what remains is only interesting to the purely scientific mind. So I apologize if a lot of these jokes lose their humor in the analysis. So there's going to be 4 parts to the lecture. The first part, we're going to focus on Franz Kafka and specifically his gestures. That is how he describes the body moving in his works and why that might be seen as funny. Next, we're going to move to the second part about humor theory, why we find things funny and the philosophy behind that. The third part will be talking about a specific type of humor called absurd humor. It's a very kind of bizarre, strange humor. And then the fourth part, we'll talk about Jewish humor and whether Kafka's humor can be seen as Jewish and absurd. My ultimate argument will be that there is a subtle humor in Kafka that is actually very similar to contemporary absurd comedy, and that we may be able to see this humor as Jewish. I'd like to tell now 2 quick jokes, and we're going to come back to them later, but for now you can just enjoy the joke, hopefully, without having to analyze it. So the first joke is that there is a young Jewish man, and he's going off to college, to university, and he really wants to become an actor, and his mother sends him to acting school in Hollywood. And he does really well, and at the end of school, he gets a big part in a movie playing a husband to a wife. So he's very excited. He comes home, so excited to tell his mother that he got this big part. And he says, "Mom, I got this big part in a film." And she says, "Oh, that's great. What are you playing?" And he says, "I'm playing the husband." And she says, They gave you a role with no speaking part?" And then another joke is one that comedian Rodney Dangerfield used to tell. He would say, "Take my wife, no, really, take her," as in take her away from me. It's a very bad joke, but it's important for later in the lecture. So Kafka, he died in 1924, but since his death, he's sort of taken on sort of his own life, you might say. As to what Kafka wrote, what's been written about him is maybe 100 or 1,000 times more. And sort of many myths and stereotypes have formed around Kafka. We see in this picture a group of, I guess, professors or intellectuals talking about Kafka. And you have Kafka here on the right side, and he's almost frustrated with all of these things that are being said about him, and he has no way of defending himself. So one myth or stereotype is that Kafka was very serious, and if you read anything by Kafka, the last thing you'll be doing is laughing. And I want to sort of correct that stereotype and argue that Kafka was actually very funny. I think he's actually one of the funniest people I've ever read or encountered. And in his personal life, too, we know that when he would read his novels to his friends, sometimes he would break out laughing. Sometimes in important meetings with his boss, he would start laughing purely at the way that his boss was maybe moving his body. And he once said to his fiancée that he was known in his family and among his friends as someone that couldn't stop that was always laughing. So there's a lot of different ways in which Kafka was funny. We can't talk about all of them tonight. We're going to talk tonight about his gestures, physical movements, as being humorous. And I should mention that his gestures have been a major topic among Kafka scholars, but to my knowledge, no one has discussed them as actually being humorous. And specifically, absurd humor has, to my knowledge, never been identified in Kafka. So it's something new I'd like to propose. So we're going to talk about a short story Kafka wrote in 1922. In German, it's called Estes Light. In English would be First Sorrow. And it's a story about a trapeze artist. And you can see him hanging here from the ceiling. And this trapeze artist is like a kind of diva. He's very high maintenance. He demands perfect conditions for his art of flying on the trapeze. And he has a manager, and on one trip to a new circus, they're sitting together in the train, and it is at that moment that the trapeze artist becomes very upset, and the manager rushes over to him to try to find out what's wrong, and the trapeze artist says, "I've decided I can no longer work with just one trapeze. I now need two at all times. One, I can't do that anymore." And the manager, he's used to handling the trapeze artist and says, "Whatever you want, of course, we can get you two trapezes in the future." And the trapeze artist, like a child, he's not at all consoled, and he suddenly bursts into tears. And at this moment, the trapeze artist yells out, just one trapeze in my hands. How can I live like this?" So the manager comforts the trapeze artist, but the way in which he comforts him is a very strange kind of gesture. And we can read now the description. So it says, "The manager caressed him and pressed his face to his own so that the trapeze artist's tears would flow over his face as well." So if you kind of picture this to yourself, this should strike you as strange, because when you comfort somebody, maybe you hug them or maybe you pat them on the back, but you certainly don't press your face next to them and share each other's tears. So it's a very strange image, and it doesn't really fit with the mood. Yeah. So we could definitely describe this gesture as highly exaggerated in terms of showing the comforting that's going on. So where was Kafka getting these gestures from? One area was from silent film. And I'm going to show now a clip from the 1922 film, which is actually the same year as the story, called Nosferatu. It was from the Weimar film era in Berlin. It was premiered in Berlin in 1922. And you should see a similar type of comforting going on and a similar type of gesture as in the story First Sorrow. So I'll play that clip now. So what is different about the gestures in Kafka versus in this film? For me, a big difference is that in the film, this is a necessary way. The characters can't speak, so this is how they show the emotions, what's going on. They have to be very exaggerated with how they move. In Kafka, it's literature, so it's a bit superfluous, excessive to have this type of kind of cheek-touching, caressing happening, and that would be a major difference. So Kafka, he was very inspired by silent film. Film was a new art form when Kafka was a young man in Prague. I think the first theater opened in Prague when Kafka was maybe, I think, 23 years old in 1907. And in addition to film, he was also very influenced by theater, specifically the Yiddish theater. And at this time, film and theater were very much overlapping genres. A lot of the actors from in film had been theater actors. So the gestures are going to be very similar in theater as well as in film. And specifically the Yiddish theater, Kafka would visit this Yiddish theater in Prague, this Yiddish theater group, at a cafe known as the Café Savoy. And in just a word about the Yiddish theater, it was very almost controversial for a Jew to be going to the Yiddish theater in Prague. Why? Because the Jews of Prague really wanted to assimilate and be Western Jews, or very German Jews, you might say. And Yiddish, there was a lot of contempt for the Jews of Eastern Europe. This particular theater group that Kafka so enjoyed came from Lviv in Ukraine. And anyway, Kafka was obsessed with this theater and especially with the gestures. And you can see here in this drawing, this is one of Kafka's drawings, showing kind of these strange movements. And we get long descriptions in his diaries where he's trying to perfectly capture the way maybe a woman tosses her hair or extends her arm. The Yiddish theater had a major influence on Kafka's literature as well. All of Kafka's famous literature that we know from the Metamorphosis onward was all written after he started visiting this theater. So it just had a major influence on him. And again, the gestures were one thing that were specifically very important to Kafka. And now I'd like to show a video of kind of just a quick documentary where you can see some Yiddish theater actors. And when you watch, I just want you to pay attention to the gestures, the way the characters are moving, and because this is the same type of movement that you see with Kafka that he captures so well.
It was beautiful, my goodness, the drama, the comedy, the singing, the dancing. It gave you heart, it gave you soul, it gave you feeling, it gave you everything that you wanted. Happiness, joy, tragedy, whatever you wanted.
Performances were emotional, raucous affairs. Entire families came munching on fruits and cracked peanuts while they laughed and cried and shouted at the actors.
Oh, they'd hiss and they'd talk. And if you played a villain, you knew that you were the villain. They booed him. Even in the bowing, they booed him.
If a character were undecided as to what...
We're going to now talk about Kafka's short story, The Judgment. In German would be Das Urteil, which Kafka wrote in 1912. And this story was very influenced by what Kafka saw at the Yiddish theater, and it was written at the same time. And this story is really considered by Kafka when he wrote it, as well as by his critics, as his kind of breakthrough story. This is really the story where Kafka became Kafka. He was 29 years old. He wrote it in one night. And it was interestingly the night of after Kol Nidre, and after Yom Kippur. I'll give a quick summary of the story, and we're going to watch a video of the of a reenactment of the story. So it starts out, the main character is a young businessman named Georg Bendemann, who many would say is based off Kafka himself. And it's about his interactions with his father, and the father seems to be based off Kafka's father. And the story starts out very pleasantly. The son is taking care of his father, his elderly father, and the son comes in to check up on his father and to ask him for some advice.
Man.
Good morning, Father.
Ah, George. Good morning to you as well.
It's quite dark in here,
Yes, it is dark.
and you've shut the window.
I prefer it that way.
You shouldn't read in the dark. And it's nice and warm outside. How about we open up that window?
No need to worry about me, son. So what brings you in here this fine morning? What did you want to talk about?
Well, after much consideration, I've decided to tell a friend in St. Petersburg about my engagement to Frida.
Oh, yes, your friend.
I didn't want him to know at first. I had made that decision out of consideration for him.
Oh, I see. Now you change.
You're remembering my friend now, aren't you?
Am I covered up now?
See, you like it in your bed, don't you?
Am I covered up now?
Don't worry. You're covered up.
No! You wanted me covered up. Oh, yes, you wanted me covered up, my little puppy. But I'm far, oh, so very far from being covered up.
Father?
Yes, and that's the point. The more truly you were a rotten human being. And therefore take note. I sentence you to death by drowning.
A little bit later in the story, we see Georg putting his father to bed so he can go to sleep. And everything is very peaceful. The father's getting ready for bed. And suddenly, there's an abrupt change in the drama of the story. The father rises up from the bed and begins screaming at Georg. And I need to warn you that it's going to be very loud in the film when this happens. The last part of the story, the father sentences his son to death by drowning. And Georg, as soon as he hears this sentence, this death sentence, he simply runs out of the house as if on command, runs out to the river, to the bridge, and he jumps over the bridge to his death and commits suicide. So this would seem to be the most climactic, the most tragic of moments. A father has just sentenced his son to die, and the son commits suicide. So in terms of what we might expect here, the description, we'd expect something very somber and serious, very kind of, in terms of describing this final jump into the water, something that's very heavy. Instead, we get this line. This is the second to last sentence of the story. He swung himself over, like the distinguished gymnast he had once been in his youth, to his parents' pride. So this is extremely subtle to notice that this might be a bit strange. The image of a gymnast, of a kind of child gymnast, is a very sort of light, almost effeminate image, has a sort of silliness to it. And at least when I read it, I always had the reaction of just kind of being puzzled or stunned that this would be the way Kafka would choose to describe the final moment of his character. I think the most important aspect of this is, at least for me, I have the experience of I'm not sure if I should be laughing at this or not. And I think that this type of humor is something all throughout Kafka, where you're kind of not sure if it's a joke or not, or if it's serious. He kind of walks this very fine line between where it's almost, maybe Kafka's the one laughing at us because we don't know if we should laugh. This is it's a surprise to what we're expecting, and this is the same kind of dynamic that we saw in First Sorrow with the manager and the gymnast, where, again, it's this strange movement and we're not really sure how to react to it. So in contrast to this kind of strange humor, this sort of maybe awkward humor, I'm now going to play a clip from Charlie Chaplin, and you'll see here that the gestures that Chaplin uses are also very exaggerated and sort of Kafkaesque, but there's no question here as to whether this is funny. This is very straightforwardly funny, traditional humor. There's no kind of, there's no debate about whether it should be funny. Now we're going to move to the second part of the lecture about humor theory and why we find things funny. So the main theory, there's sort of a lot of debate about why we laugh, but incongruity theory is by far the most prominent, well-accepted theory, which basically holds that we laugh when there's sort of two things that don't really fit together. We're maybe expecting something normal, we get something else, and this incongruity, this tension, gives rise to something funny and causes us to laugh. All humor, in some way, usually has these incongruities, these tensions at the core. Even, this is a theory that many famous philosophers have used in one way or another. Going back to Pascal in the 17th century, the French philosopher, he said that nothing produces laughter more than a surprising disproportion between that which one expects and that which one sees. So going back to the jokes I told at the beginning, the first joke about the Jewish son who becomes a famous actor, he goes home and tells his mom, I got this big acting part, and we're expecting her to say, oh, congratulations, or he says that, he tells her that he's the husband, and we expect her to just say, oh, that's great, you know. But instead, she surprises us, our expectations, and she says, oh, they gave you a role with no speaking part. So that would be the incongruity. And also with this, again, this very sort of classic joke, like, take my wife. No, really, take her. Like, take her away from me. Again, we're expecting just take my wife as in take my wife, for example. But it's the word take is being played with, and it becomes take her, like physically remove her. I'd now like to show a Woody Allen movie, a clip from a Woody Allen movie called Love and Death. And this clip will show incongruity theory really in a very, very vivid, sort of very obvious way, where Woody Allen is actually, he's himself, he's like this sort of New York Jewish, you know who Woody Allen is, and he is in the Russian Empire around the time of Napoleon, and he's fighting for the Russian army, for the Tsar, and he essentially in every scene just doesn't fit in, and this sort of incongruity, this sort of this not fitting in is what creates the humor. None other than Immanuel Kant had a lot to say about humor, and he had his own sort of version of the incongruity theory. He said that laughter is what occurs when there's a sudden transformation of strained expectations into nothing. Essentially, it's the same kind of idea where your mind is expecting something, and you're expecting it, and then all the strain of the expectations are suddenly destroyed, and you're left with nothing, essentially. The punchline sort of dispels the tension. The important point about Kant is, first we need to remember that he was a philosopher of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment believed that reason was the pathway to truth, that if we carefully use logic and reason, we'll get to the answer. And for Kant, as you can maybe see from this quote, he almost was offended by the idea of a joke, because a joke, by its very nature, is illogical. It doesn't really lead to anything important. It just sort of kind of collapses. And actually, Kant even had a physiological theory that we laugh because we have this tension that builds up in us, and the laughter is a way of sort of expelling this tension from our bodies. So he really didn't give humor, the joke, any kind of philosophical importance. So you might be wondering, okay, is it really so simple as you just take two concepts and put them together and suddenly you have something funny? Well, it's really not that simple, because humor is really an art. And you can have, I'm sure we've all had experience where we've heard bad jokes where we have like, ha, that's kind of funny. And then we've had moments where we're hysterically laughing, we can't stop laughing. And the reason you have this reaction, why you can have a very, very strong reaction to humor versus a very weak reaction, has to do with the art of humor. So if you have multiple incongruities happening at once and the tension is right and the timing is right, this could create, very wild laughter in somebody. And then if something's a little bit off, you might just go, oh, okay, haha, kind of funny, but not really. A nice way to understand this would be to compare it with music. So we have all different kinds of music, and sometimes I'll play a piece from Mozart, and this would be music where all of the notes are perfectly kind of in order and everything is harmoniously working together.
So that pattern can work.
And there's more than just the incongruity that creates laughter. There's also a very important element, which is truth. So there's something about the joke has to register with us as true. We have to sort of relate to it in some way to cause us to laugh. It's not always immediately obvious what that is, but if we return again to those jokes, the joke about the Jewish actor playing the husband is, we're laughing to some extent about the sort of stereotype relationship in a Jewish household where it's sometimes said that the husband isn't allowed to say anything, the wife sort of dominates the conversation. So the joke reveals that truth to us, and that's why we laugh. So if the joke had been, let's say, instead of Jewish, there was a Swedish family, and he comes home from acting school and he says, he's Swedish, his mom's Swedish, and says, oh, they gave you a role with no speaking part. It's the same incongruity, but it's not really funny because there's no reputation of Swedish husbands and wives, as far as I know, that the wife isn't allowed to speak, or the husband's not allowed to speak. So the joke doesn't work because the truth is not there. But on the other hand, and well, also again, take my wife. If it had been like, take my brother, no, really, take him, it's still the same punchline, but it's not funny because the brother, there's no like sort of joke about brothers getting along or whatever. But I also want to say that what if you just had a Jewish husband that just says, it really bothers me that my wife doesn't let me talk at the dinner table. If he just says that, it's the same truth, but it's not funny because it doesn't have the timing or the tension of a joke. So to create humor, there has to be the truth plus like the art of the humor with the tension and the timing and everything. Now I'd like to move to the third part of the lecture about a specific type of humor, absurd humor. So absurd humor, like all humor, relies, again, on incongruity theory. And it's a little bit like absurd philosophy. Of course, we have famous absurd philosophers like Albert Camus, but Camus wasn't really very funny. So absurd, it has its sort of same underlying bizarreness, but it has the form of humor. It has the same tension and timing. And I think what distinguishes absurd humor from other humor is that it doesn't have an object of the laughter. The laughter sort of comes from just pure silliness, pure ridiculousness. So the joke about the Jewish husband joke, that has a clear object. It's pointing something out about husband-wife relations. Absurd humor is sort of a laughing at, almost like laughing at nothingness, or kind of a laughing at just the absurdity of what's happening. I'm going to now play two clips, and the first one will be from the silent film actor Buster Keaton, and then the next clip will be from the movie Man on the Moon, starring Jim Carrey playing the comedian Andy Kaufman. And I want you to ask yourself, they're both very sort of similar comedian with the camera, and they're both very much relying on incongruities, but I want you to ask yourself if there's something different about the way the humor in Andy Kaufman, or Jim Carrey, Andy Kaufman, strikes you compared to Buster Keaton, if you're laughing maybe for a different reason. Jewish comedian Andy Kaufman.
Аплодисменты. Что это с парнем? Это не идет в эфир.
Mr. Trouble never hangs around when he hears this mighty sound. Here I come to save the day. That means a tiny mouse is on the way. Yes, sir, when there is a wrong to right, Mighty Mouse will join the fight. On the sea or on the land, he gets the situation well in hand.
So though we are in danger, we never despair, 'cause we know that where there's danger, he is there.
He is there on the land, on the sea, in not worrying at all. We're just listening for his call. Here I come to save the day. That gives us
So both of these are relying on incongruities. The reading the newspaper, you kind of expect just a guy reading the paper, and it gets bigger and bigger, and that's the joke. With this, too, it's sort of, you're expecting him, for one thing, to talk and give a stand-up comedy, but he doesn't. He just stands there and creates enormous tension. So they're very similar comedians, like they're both very good with timing. The timing of Andy Kaufman is excellent. It's really perfectly spot on. And if anything was the slightest bit off, the joke wouldn't work. But there's also, you see the audience, like they're not sure if they should be laughing. It's just, there's a certain absurdity to it. There's a certain strangeness to it. That's part of the reason, that's sort of where the humor comes from. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that doesn't seem that absurd. It's just a guy that doesn't say anything in his stand-up routine, but okay. I want to show another clip. This is very absurd comedy. It's from the 90s, from MTV, show called The State. The actor, he's also Jewish, actor that we'll see. And it's about a guy who, he goes up to try to pick up a girl, and he's not successful. And the reason he's not successful is because we find out he's not wearing any pants. And the rest of the skit is him trying to figure out how to wear pants so that he can get girls. And this is really pure absurdity because there is no truth about a guy that can't get girls because he doesn't wear pants. Like, that doesn't exist in our world. So if we laugh at this, you know, I'm sure maybe not everyone will find it funny, but we're really laughing at just kind of pure absurdity, not at any kind of societal commentary or something. We said before, we only laugh if something is true, it registers with us. So in a way, Kant was right in that he was right and he was wrong, because he said that a joke sort of collapses into a kind of nothingness. While in a way he's right, because a joke doesn't really lead anywhere, but in a way he's totally wrong, because really there's really few things in life that reveal that we have a physiological reaction to that really it's hard to deny as laughter. So this could be a bit troubling. If we're laughing at the absurd, then that must mean that there's something about absurdity, about the absurdity of life or reality, whatever you want to say, that registers with us as being true. And now this is actually, might not seem like a big deal, but it could be very, a kind of very nihilistic or very sort of kind of a frightening idea. My argument is that in this gesture where Georg jumps over the bridge and he's described as this kind of gymnast, this is a very subtle form of absurd humor. And the same with this, the face touching in First Sorrow. It's again, like an undermining of our expectations as to what should be happening, but it's doing so in a way where the object of the joke is just kind of pure silliness. It's kind of happening for no reason. It's very absurd. And in a way, this type of humor really, when we saw the video of The State and the woman, she pulls off her wig. For some reason, she's wearing a wig. It really makes no sense. But there's something humorous about this, at least from my understanding of humor. And I think that it's the same, Kafka is doing the same type of humor in his literature. I think a good way of understanding this is to maybe think of science as an analogy. So Isaac Newton had a very reasoned, logical understanding of reality. He developed clear laws for all of the physical actions in the universe. Everything was very profound, but also very grounded in these Newtonian laws. And these are true, right? Like there's nothing, he discovered the truth of the universe. And on the other hand, then we have a few centuries later, we have Max Planck, or we could also say Albert Einstein, who discovered, well, Planck specifically discovered that at the subatomic level, things behave very strangely, very bizarrely. So, for example, electrons can be actually in multiple places at the same time, defying logic. They can move from space to space without actually traversing that area. So they're both, Planck's theory is just as true as Newton's theory, but one is very comfortable, which is Newton, and one is very troubling and absurd, which would be Planck. So we're now at the final part of the lecture, and we're going to talk about Jewish humor. Oops. And, okay, Jewish humor. So Jewish humor, what is Jewish humor? Has certain kind of words we might associate with it, a lot of complaining, self-deprecating, very cynical, neurotic is another word we get a lot with Jewish humor, guilt. I'm going to play a clip from the comedian Larry David, a Jewish comedian, where he tries to explain what Jewish humor is. And we'll also see within this clip Woody Allen again and Joan Rivers explaining their kind of giving you an idea of Jewish humor, showing this neurotic, self-deprecating style.
It's a difficult question for you. I love Jewish humor, but I don't know exactly what it is. What's Jewish humor?
I really don't know. I don't know what it is. I know that there's a lot of Jews in comedy.
There's themes to Jewish humor that you could probably cite. Neuroses.
Don't you see the rest of the country looks upon New York like we're left-wing communist, Jewish, homosexual pornographers? I think of us that way sometimes, and I live here.
There's a lot of complaining, I guess. Being dealt a bad hand. It's tevya, isn't it? The weight of the world on your shoulders,
fantastic,
complaining. Yeah. I think it's a lot of that.
And my parents really didn't like me. They told me I was Jewish on Christmas morning, and they just said, wake up, you're Jewish! Empty stocking. But
so it's a little bit unfair to say that this is Jewish humor because it's really Jewish American humor. It just so happens that Hollywood, of course, is kind of the entertainment industry, and a lot of American Jews are in Hollywood, so that sort of becomes our conception of Jewish humor. But I would imagine that the Jews in France or the Jews in Beersheba, Israel, maybe have slightly different senses of humor. So the next question is, where does Jewish humor come from? We can't deny that there are a lot of Jewish comedians. Huge majority of comedians are Jewish. So there are different theories. One is that Jews have suffered a lot in our history, and this gives rise to humor because we've been tuned in to kind of the grim realities of life that we can make fun of. There's also this idea of otherness, that Jews have kind of always been on the outside and had to experience the pain and suffering of that, and always had a kind of insightful view of society based on this otherness. And in general, Jewish education encourages a kind of skepticism. So it's common for students to question their rabbi. It's encouraged to have this kind of radical skepticism where everything can be questioned or doubted. And this is something you see as well even in Israel. in Israeli schools, the students will argue with their teachers, will yell at their teacher. And even in the army, there's really not much of a hierarchy. The lower soldiers can question their commanding officers, which is something that doesn't exist in most other armies in the world. And this kind of this extreme skepticism is a way of, can lead to humor, because you're looking at things as they are, and you're trying to find flaws, and you're trying to point out, you're trying to show things. Humor has a way of kind of observing flaws in the system, and Judaism maybe encourages that. Kafka as a Jewish humorist is something that has been discussed. In his first novella, Metamorphosis, we have Gregor Samsa waking up as a bug. This could be seen as Jewish humor, this kind of Woody Allen type of pessimism, like this kind of neuroses, you might say. Then we have his famous novel, The Trial, about Joseph K., a character who's has a very hyper sense of guilt. Guilt, of course, is another trope of Jewish humor. And then his final novel from 1922, The Castle, about a character who is the only member of the village who's not part of the castle. Again, this otherness could be seen as a very Jewish trope. But we saw that Kafka also has this other kind of humor, this very silly, absurd humor. And my question is, to what extent can we see this absurd humor as being Jewish? Also, Andy Kaufman was Jewish, and the character from the Pants skit is Jewish. A lot of this absurd humor is coming from Jews. And on one hand, they're very different styles of humor, because Jewish humor has a target, has an object, namely Jews. But absurd humor, we said, it's just kind of this pure silliness. So in a way, they're very different, but in a way, they're also very similar. In a way, though, they're very similar because absurd humor is kind of taking this skepticism of Jewish humor like to its utmost extreme, where it's kind of creating skepticism over reality itself. And I would even say that the pessimism of Jewish humor is actually, in absurd humor, it might be an extreme pessimism where reality itself is being sort of minimalized, right? Like it's a kind of nihilism where it's sort of saying nothing really matters. We can just laugh at existence. It's a very absurd humor has a certain decadence to it, a certain decadence and a certain rebelliousness to it, right? Like for Kafka to do this gesture of the gymnast, it's almost like an undermining of literature itself, of the literary canon, to just kind of have this very dramatic movement, the suicide, where Kafka says, yeah, I'm just going to have my character do something very silly at this moment for no reason. So just to conclude, I'd like to ask if absurd humor is healthy. So I have here a picture on the right, or the left, your left, is Bob Hope speaking to the American troops during World War II, and he would try to cheer them up by telling nice jokes that made everyone laugh, and like, you know, these were very traditional jokes with punchline. There was definitely nothing like absurd to them. And a generation later, we get Andy Kaufman. And here, the humor becomes much more strange. On one hand, there's something very comforting about this old-fashioned humor. We don't have to question if we should be laughing. It's very sort of, we know where we stand. Absurd humor is like I said, it's a very kind of rebellious, very kind of sort of decadent quality to it, but it's also very, first, I would say funnier, in my opinion, and also maybe more liberating. I remember as a kid, I would watch a lot of shows that would be considered absurd comedy, like The Simpsons or Family Guy, and Saturday Night Live. And whenever I'd watch with my dad, the jokes just wouldn't register with him. And I never knew if I should feel bad for him or if I should feel bad for myself. Because maybe it's, if you're not tuned into that type of humor, maybe you're actually better off. So, yeah, that's my lecture. Thank you.